So today we're going to talk about obviously attracting larval host plants or attracting butterflies and moths and the plants that you can use in your garden that are attractive for them. But we're going to go a little bit more in depth with that, in the sense that I want to talk about, sorry, I'm still trying to figure out technology. I kind of want to talk about Lepidopterans as they fit within the framework of the larger group Insecta, and then how they fit within the context of, say, what they feed on, being a specialist, being a generalist, and what all of that means. So today's talk is probably more ecology based than just here's a plant, put it in the ground, and it will attract this. So we are going to talk about that, but it's going to be more centered around the environment and that ecological perspective. So some of you may be familiar or know this already, but insects are the largest class of terrestrial organisms. They comprise almost 1 million species of within almost 1 million identified species, and it's estimated that there could be upwards of 2 to 3 million species that haven't been described. So, I always think that that's pretty incredible. That, insects are such a large group, very diverse. They fit within many different ecological niches and things that we would not consider to be very hospitable environments. So insects really do comprise a larger group of our terrestrial organisms. Within the insects, Lepidopterans take up about 16%. So up here in this little pie chart, they're 16% of the 925,000 or so insect species are Lepidopterans, and that would be, butterflies and moths. Beetles, coleopterans, comprise about 40% of that. So there's a pretty large group. Flies are 12%. Hymenopterans, which are your bees and wasps, they're about 13%. And then some of the other smaller groups kind of take up various percentages of the pie. So the Lepidopterans, the Dipterans, Hymenopterans, and Coleopterans are part of what are known as the Big Four. And then again, today we're just going to focus primarily on Lepidopterans. Okay, so I want to start out by testing your knowledge. What percentage of Lepidopteran species are considered plant feeders? Give a minute. Charlotte, how long do you want to?
We've got 123 votes now out of 179 participants. We got about 70% of people have voted.
Still getting.
You want to go ahead and call it?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead and close it. We'll give folks about 3 more seconds if you want to vote, and we'll share the results. 1, 2, 3. All right, you should see the results.
All right.
With our leading vote for C.
Yeah, leading vote for C, and that is the correct answer. 100% of the 122,000 or so Lepidopterans are exclusively plant feeders. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. How do we relaunch our poll here, Charlotte?
I'll get it going again.
All right. So what percentage of our Lepidopterans are considered to be plant specialists?
Got about 70% of folks have voted, so we'll give it a few more seconds if you want to get your vote in. We'll close it down in about 3 seconds. So 1, 2, and 3. There we go.
All right, so looks like most of the responses were for C. Many of you said 100%. Our next highest response was 90%, and that is actually the correct answer. So 90% of those 120 or so thousand species are considered specialists. And we'll talk about what it means to be a specialist in the upcoming slides. So 90% feed on, in some cases, just one genus within one genus of plants, say milkweed, for example, within the genus Asclepias. But some, even though they're considered specialists, have a broader palette. So they may feed on plants within a couple of different families. So they have a broader palette, but they are still considered specialists. And then there are those, that 10% that feed pretty much on anything. Okay, so very good there. All right, so I always like to tell sort of the story, the history of what, I don't know that I've coined this, but I've definitely used this phrase before. It's the longest arms race on the planet, which would be those interactions between plants and insects. So, you know, plants have been around for hundreds of millions of years, insects the same. So this, you know, this coevolution between plants and insects has been going on for a really long time. And so I have to give this a little bit of context before we really get into the details. But insects feed on plants for the most part. Many of those, you know, million or so, or almost nearly 1 million species are primarily plant feeders. Within the beetles, for example, and we'll get to that in just a minute, many of those species are plant feeders. So we have two broad categories of interactions. Herbivory, which would be, you know, feeding directly on the plant, on some part of the plant, whether it's the leaves or the flowers or whatever it may be. You have leaf chewers, you have sapsuckers, predation on seeds, gall inducers, and leaf miners. And then you have the insect-plant mutualism, and that really is specifically for pollination. And there's a really cool, you know, talking about pollination, many of you are familiar with pollinator syndromes, how insects are attracted to plants and the strategies that plants use to lure insects, tricking them into pollinating them, whether it's the promise of a potential mate or a food resource or something. Plants have really developed some interesting ways that they get insects to them. But then there are some maybe less well-known or less talked about, the plant insect defenses. So we talk a lot about how insects feed on plants, and we don't really think about what it takes to be an herbivore. So plants have many ways that they can defend themselves. They have quantitative and qualitative toxins that maybe the insect has to feed on it. Many ingest a lot of these toxins over time. Sometimes it may be fatal, sometimes it's not. Plants have physical defenses. So if you felt the hairs on the plant, on a stem before, or the prickles or the spines or the tough leathery leaves, those are all defenses. And part of those defenses are used to keep insects from feeding on them. But insects always counteract, right? So it's always that one-upmanship that we see. So the example here would be how monarchs use the sap from milkweed plants to protect themselves. And that's just one example. So our Lepidopterans, there's the largest lineage of plant-feeding insects. That's a bit of a typo. I think there's more like, they should say about 120, 130,000 species of these are plant feeders. And then as I mentioned earlier, many of these are specialists. So while they don't just feed on one species of plant necessarily, 90% of caterpillars' larval forms of butterflies and moths feed on only a few groups or species of plants. And then coleopterans, which are your beetles. There's 100,000 species of those are phytophagous, meaning that they feed on plants. And believe it or not, many of those are specialists. They only sort of browse on a few families or even maybe species of plants. So many beetles are actually not generalists. They require, in some cases, specific plants to complete their life cycle. And we'll get into that in just a moment. And then the orthopterans, which are your grasshoppers and your crickets. Now, this is a relatively small group, but 95% of them, of the grasshoppers, katydids, crickets, they feed on plants too. And I think, unfortunately, we kind of lump this group into pests, what we would consider pests. So grasshoppers that feed on ornamental grasses or whatever it is, we tend to treat these guys as maybe no more or no better than just, you know, something to feed the birds, but they do still serve a purpose, and they are specialists, feeding on a lot of different plants. Okay. So here's just a table to kind of give you the relative, you know, how many species and then the number of those species that are herbivores. So you see the beetles, you know, pretty large group with a third of those species feeding on plants or being specialists. And then Lepidopterans here, 100%. And there are a few weird Lepidopterans that are born without mouth parts that don't actually feed, but are still considered specialists. And again, we'll get into that in just a moment with some specific examples. So I kind of want to just go a little bit deeper here is that, you know, we think of, if you think of being a specialist, you know, what does it mean to specialize on something? And you may think that it's just kind of this easy thing that, you know, insects feed on milkweed or, you know, one particular plant, but it's really not all that easy. Plants themselves aren't always the most nutritious form or the most nutritious source of food that insects can feed on. So insects have to be choosy. They have to select the part of the plant that they can eat. They have to be able to overcome the plant defenses. You know, plants by design, as I mentioned, they're not the most nutritious. So what that means is if you spend a lot of time feeding on a plant to try to compensate for the nutrition, is that means that you're exposed for longer periods of time to potential predators, whether that's insects or birds or whatever. So it's not easy being a specialist, and it's not easy being an herbivore. So I just kind of want to point this out is that, you know, we sort of take it for granted that insects, they really have to overcome a lot in order to be able to, you know, just get the nutrition that they need. And I apologize for this, but some of my stuff got cut off, but this is a postman butterfly, kind of a shout out to our postal service workers who are on the front line. But this is actually a tropical butterfly. It doesn't occur here, but you can find this species in Mexico. This postman butterfly is a specialist on passion flower. And passion flower, many of you are familiar with our native passion flower that grows here in North America. And this native passion flower grows in Mexico. So the life cycle for this particular species is that the female lays eggs on a passion flower, and there are several species that grow in that area. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae feed on, you know, various parts of the plant. However, there is one species of passion flower, and this is kind of a crapshoot, but there's one species of passion flower that grows in this area that have these sharp spines or prickles on the stems. So as the caterpillar, as the larval form is feeding on the plant, it's actually getting, it's death by 1,000 knives. So it's slowly being stabbed to death by this one particular plant. So not all of the passion flower species have this adaptation, but you can see here that if the adult happened to, if you choose the wrong plant, it essentially means that those larvae won't survive. So it really is a difficult and challenging world for many of our insect species, but for specialists in particular. And then in some cases, it's not all bad, but there are cases of coevolution, these mutual and necessary, what we call obligative mutualisms, that the insects and the plants themselves rely on each other literally for one another's survival. So the example here, and many of you are probably familiar at least with yucca, the plant yucca, maybe not so much this moth, but this is a species of moth that occurs exclusively on yucca plants. It doesn't pollinate or feed on any other species of plants, and it only completes its life cycle within the flowers of the yucca plant. So yucca moths have a pretty cool sort of life history in that the moths, or the female moths, are born without mouth parts. So as adults, they don't even feed. What you end up with is a moth that what she does is she'll scrape pollen from one plant, she'll fly to another plant, and she actually, just like if you've ever hand pollinated something, she'll climb up to the stigma or the style, and she will put the pollen on the end of that male part of the plant. So she gets no reward from the pollen because they don't feed, but they require one another. So the yucca moths have a really interesting adaptation. And then the larva, the eggs are laid, and then the larva will feed on, the seeds and, other materials from the yucca plant, and then the life cycle continues. So this is a species that does occur here. We grow Yucca filamentosa for the most part in North Carolina, and this is an insect that I would fully expect to see, but it's pretty small. You have to get really up close to see these. So next time you're visiting a yucca plant in flower, maybe poke your head into a couple of the flowers and see what you can find. Now, everybody knows the story of the monarch, and yeah, I am going to talk a little bit about the monarch today, but there really are some really cool and interesting things about milkweed as a plant. Monarchs get all the press, and that is great and wonderful because it does raise awareness from conservation standpoint. But we all sort of know that monarchs specialize on milkweed. They don't feed on any other genera of plants. They require that milky latex sap as a part of their life cycle. They use it as a defense strategy. But there are other species, and remember I was talking about beetles a moment ago. This is the milkweed longhorn beetle. Not very creative. It has long antennae and it feeds on milkweed, but this is a specialist of milkweed plants. And what's actually pretty interesting about this particular species is that while the female feeds on the leaves, and the males, while they feed on the leaves, they actually cannot ingest that milky latex sap. So what the female will do, keep saying the female, what the adults will do is that they travel to the base of the leaf and they clip the midvein and drain that milky latex sap from the leaf. And then they'll move to the top of the leaf where they can safely feed on the plant without having to worry about ingesting those toxic chemicals that might kill it. Here's a milkweed leaf beetle. Again, not very creative. It feeds on milkweed, milkweed leaves to be precise. This is a milkweed weevil, another beetle species. And actually what's cool about this particular species is that the female doesn't feed on the plant necessarily. What she does is she chews a small hole in the stem of the milkweed plant, and she will deposit eggs there. And then once the eggs hatch, the larvae are actually feeding on the stems of the milkweed plant. So I've talked a lot about beetles, and I promise we're getting to the butterflies and the moths. But again, just to kind of illustrate that, you know, a lot of insects are specialists, and even if they don't get the press, they're still out there and they're worth observing. Here's your first Lepidopteran. This is the milkweed tussock moth. You can kind of see these brightly colored orange hairs. This really sort of alarming, brightly colored look is, as you might have guessed, a way to ward off or warn any potential predators. What's actually interesting about this one, this is a moth as an adult, and this is not my picture. I believe I've got the citation at the bottom, but no, it got trimmed off. Anyway, as an adult, the moth is nocturnal, and bats are notorious insectivores. So what's really cool about this particular species is that it uses echo sonar, basically a way to disrupt echolocation. So as this moth is flying around at night, it will actually emit a series of clicks that interfere with the echolocation of bats, but it's also a warning signal. So the next time you're watching bats, you know, at night or something as they're coming out, keep that in mind that, you know, you may have milkweed tussock moths out there that are letting the bats know, hey, this is an undesirable food source, so you want to stay away from me. And the milkweed tussock moth, obviously, they ingest the latex sap. So this is another strategy that insects have, or this particular species has used. I just thought it was a really interesting behavior because we don't always see that in the insect world where, you know, they're using noises or whatever to disrupt would-be predators. They usually are going after the camouflage. And then if you've grown milkweed, you obviously know about aphids. We already have aphids in our garden now on our milkweed, but I just kind of want to illustrate a few things that are going on. So if you've ever looked closely at a milkweed plant and you've noticed all the brightly colored aphids, but you get to these little brown bloated carcasses, these are actually aphid mummies, and they've been parasitized by a beneficial wasp that specializes on milkweed aphids, which are specialists of milkweed. So this, trying to build up this food web to kind of illustrate, and here's where I really wanted to maybe bring this all together, is that, you know, as insects are feeding on plants, plants are emitting chemicals. They're trying to protect themselves outright by trying to get insects to stop feeding, but they're also emitting distress signals in the environment. And predators, parasites, they cue in on those chemicals, and that's what brings them to their food source. So, you know, one milkweed plant, we've talked about several, you know, specialist interactions that occur on this one plant. So you can imagine what your landscape would look like if you went 100% native, with native trees and native perennials and the whole nine. So these really complex interactions occur in your backyard. It's just, again, it's something that's worth observing when you have the time, and worth noting and kind of thinking through sort of the cause and effect of what it means when you plant a native plant in your landscape. So Luna moths are a very common sort of a gateway, what I would think is a gateway insect into, you know, getting into entomology. Very charismatic as adults. You typically will find the adults sort of late summer, kind of glued to a window or a door with a glass frame or something. Obviously, the adults are highly attractive. They're in the family Saturniidae. This is a large, pretty charismatic group of moths, very robust in size too, as we'll see in some of these later slides. But Luna moths are, as caterpillars, specialists on many, many different plants, but they prefer sweet gum. And I can already hear the mumblings and the grumblings out there of folks who have sweet gums in their yard. Obviously, the spiky seed pods that drop on the ground are very unpleasant when you're walking barefoot. But sweet gum is a preferred host plant for Luna moths. They do occasionally feed on things like persimmons or hickories, walnuts, sumacs, which grow very well. All of these plants grow very well in North Carolina. But again, sweet gum is sort of that preferred food source. Now, Luna moths, going back to this slide, when the caterpillars pupate, they actually pupate in the soil, and the pupa look just like leaf debris. So this is really important because I see a lot of folks in the fall bagging up their leaves and putting them on the roadside, but I would strongly encourage you that, especially if you have sweet gums, try to avoid cleaning up any leaf debris, because you may be scraping up or getting rid of some of these Luna moth pupae that have laid or sort of overwintered there in the soil. When to look, these are pretty common throughout the warmer months, as most insects are. It does have kind of a longer season, so March through September. Luna moths actually have 2 to 3 broods in one season. So, if you don't get that first spring, you don't see any in the spring, you have a couple of other chances throughout the summer and even into the fall. Just like many moths, they're nocturnal, very strong flyers, and then they're going to be attracted to porch lights. And that can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing, because those porch lights really disrupt how moths in general are able to navigate and locate prey, or excuse me, not prey, but how are they able to mate, and then exposes them as prey to would-be predators. Another one in the Saturniid group, another very charismatic and very common moth, is the imperial moth. That picture you see there, that middle picture, that is, I took that picture. That creature was on my finger. So these are really formidable looking insects as larvae, and maybe are, I don't know, they can be off-putting if you're not familiar with them. Obviously, something that large can be quite alarming, but they're not harmful at all. They're not going to bite. They're not going to sting. I actually found this one sort of, I think it was late August, early September, and it was, I think it was wandering. I found it sort of aimlessly crawling around in a parking lot. So I got a chance to get some pictures, and then I set it free in the fig bush that you see behind me there. But this is a common one, and you will see it most of the year in the warmer months. It has a really large host range. So it can feed on plants in the Pinus genus. It can feed on oaks, sweet gums, maples, and sassafras. So this one has a pretty large host range that it specializes on. So if you have these plants around your yard, I dare say that you're going to find one or more of these later in the season. But they only have one brood, so you're going to find these April through October, but they're kind of a slower life cycle than your Luna moths. Now, if you've ever stumbled across this guy, this is a hickory horn devil. Also in the group Saturniidae. You kind of see a general trend here with this particular family. Really terrifying as a larva. I mean, I can't think of anything that, if you're to the untrained eye, that could be more alarming, especially when you consider that this thing can be upwards of 3-4 inches long, maybe longer in some cases. I know Charlotte has a picture that she shared with me, and that thing was almost it was about from her index finger down to her wrist. So it was a large caterpillar, but they're totally harmless. They're all show and no bite, so that's good to know. And I apologize for the typo, but for your imperial moth, excuse me, for your hickory horn devils, as the name implies, they do feed on plants in the walnut family. Your hickories, pecans, that kind of thing. Not sweet spire, but persimmons. Again, sweet gums. You kind of see a common theme here with this group. So this should say hickory horn devil, not imperial moth. I apologize. And then as an adult, this thing is, I mean, I can't, just seeing this always, I'm like, I can't believe, number one, that this thing has a 5 to 6 inch wingspan, but something that beautiful. I mean, it really just stands out. So this is, again, this group, the Saturniids, are really interesting group in their own way, but they're very charismatic in the sense that if you wanted to sort of get into entomology as a general science, this is a great group to start with and learn about, especially with kids, because it's something that, they can see and they can touch. And again, they're just really beautiful, very interesting animals. Hackberry emperors are another group. These are in the family Nymphalidae. So this group, also called the brush-footed butterflies, have reduced forelegs, but as the name implies, the hackberry emperor feeds on only plants in the Celtis genus. So if you're really wanting to attract hackberry emperors to your garden, you have to plant hackberries. They don't feed on anything else. So they're kind of the opposite of the other Saturniids, the ones that we learned about previously, that they only feed on a few species or within one genus of plants. Now they do have 2 broods from May to October, so you can see these in the really warmer parts of the month. And they're very noticeable because the males will perch in sunny areas. And just like with the caterpillars, the males like to sort of hang out on the undersides of the leaves. So you'll oftentimes find them hanging upside down, either on the branches as a caterpillar, or the adults, the males, will also sort of rest underneath the leaves. But they really like sunny areas. They'll watch for females, so they can be territorial during this time too. But they're not going to harm you. Another pretty interesting one in this same group, the nymphalids. This is the silvery checker spot. Again, just a really interesting butterfly. And the larva is a specialist actually has a pretty large host range, but it likes plants in the Rudbeckia genus. So your coneflowers, echinacea, black-eyed Susans, and then your sunflowers. So if you grow helianthus, any of those, this plant, or excuse me, this insect has a wide range of host plants that it can feed on. So the thing about silvery checker spots that I found pretty interesting was that they're pretty curious. So you'll oftentimes, if you're in these fields or wherever their host range may be, you may actually get visited by a silvery checker spot, and typically those are the males. They're just trying to sort of feel you out and see what's there, size up the competition. I have read that they've been observed to go after frisbees. They are pretty territorial. So I can't really think though of anything that's, getting attacked by a group of butterflies. I mean, I don't really think there's anything cuter than that, right? So I wouldn't worry too much about getting plagued, or not plagued, but just getting bum rushed by a group of silvery checker spots. Usually it's the males, and usually they're just sort of sizing you up, like I said. They have 1 brood, kind of a smaller window of when they're active, June to July. They are skeletonizers, so they don't chew all parts of the leaf. So if you're looking at, say, your black-eyed Susans, and you're noticing that the upper surfaces of the leaf have been skeletonized, it's a good chance that what you're seeing is silvery checker spot caterpillar feeding activity. They will hang out on the undersides of the leaves during the day, so keep an eye out for that. These are pretty easy to spot, and they're very common.
We have a question in the chat, Sam.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat about that group of Lepidopteran, the Nymphalidae. I think I'm saying that right. As a group, are they territorial?
I think as a group, generally they're not territorial, and it's mostly the males. And I mean, there's a few within that genus that they are, or within that family that, there's 700 and some species in the nymphalids. They're not all territorial. So you think about, monarchs they're not territorial. So silvery checker spots are just sort of that outlier within that group where, what defenses could you think that a butterfly actually has? It's not going to bite you. So anyway, it's more of an outlier than it is a diagnostic feature for that group per se. Are there any more questions?
There was one just popped in that says you've mentioned biting. Could you say something about that?
Biting?
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry. No, they're not going to bite. So moths and butterflies as adults have a coiled proboscis it doesn't have any, grinding structures or anything that's going to bite you. They're used exclusively for feeding on the nectar of plants. So the adults won't bite you. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that you were going to get bitten by a bunch of silvery checker spots, but yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that. Now, there are some that if you see the caterpillars and they're pretty hairy, I typically stay away from those because sometimes they can have irritants in in those little hairs. Sometimes the hairs themselves are hooked. So if you think of if you've ever rubbed your hand over fiberglass, or if you've ever walked through a patch of stinging nettle, that's kind of what that feels like. And there are some southern flannel moth that was really popular about 5 or 6 years ago in the news, would actually cause a reaction on your skin if you were to pick it up. So sometimes these things are best observed without touching. Just take pictures, look at them, but don't pick them up. And if you're in doubt, just don't handle them. I'm still pretty aware of these different types of caterpillars and what I think may or may not sting me. So I tend to, stay away from them if I can help it. Otherwise, they're best observed just sort of watching and taking pictures, like I said. What else?
You're good. Right. Linda just said she would love to be swarmed by butterflies.
Who wouldn't? That's got to be everybody's dream, right? To get swarmed by butterflies. I don't know. This one is, I keep saying this, and I apologize, everybody, that I keep saying this one is really cool, or this one is my favorite. I'll probably say that a lot. And this is coming from somebody whose interest wasn't in butterflies and moths. But as you really get into just observing your garden, I think you're going to be blown away at the things that are there, the critters, the animals that live there. And this one is a perfect example of something that if you were walking past it, you would have missed it. And even if you were just looking at these flowers really up close, you probably still would have missed it. This is a wavy lined emerald. And does everybody see this? This little C shape here on the black-eyed Susan? Yeah, so that is the wavy lined emerald larva, and it's in the family Geometridae. And this is a pretty large group, about 14 to 1,500 species that have been identified. Excuse me. But this is the only species within that group that actively uses the debris from plants that it feeds on to camouflage itself. And I got to tell you, I mean, if you weren't, the only reason that I even saw this was because I was sitting down. I think I might have been pulling weeds or something. And I just stopped for a moment to take a picture. And I see this little thing sort of crawling around. It almost looks like it's just a part of the plant. It was blowing in the wind. It really mimicked the movements of the plant very well. And if you weren't watching this, you would have totally missed it. And I just, there are these times where, as an entomologist, you find stuff, you're like, wow, what is this? I'm going to go, just do my internet search, and you look in your books, and it's like, wow, this is a wavy lined emerald, and it has a really interesting biology and behavior. So I've found this on obviously black-eyed Susans. I've also seen it on mountain mint. A few flowers down, though, I actually found, this is what the adult looks like. And actually found this, and I was never able to confirm this, although I know Matt Bertone's out there in the audience. I always suspected that this particular caterpillar maybe had been parasitized by something, whether it was a parasitic fly or a wasp, I don't know, but this structure here that you see sort of attached to the body, it looks like a cocoon of some kind. So I kind of thought that maybe this had been parasitized, and this was just a few flowers down. So again, if you're looking really closely, you'll find that there's a whole myriad of things in your garden that maybe you would have not avoided, but just overlooked. So again, these really, really cool and interesting things that if you plant it, I know you've heard it, if you plant it, they will come. And it's amazing all the interactions that would occur in your yard, just again, on this one species, on this one particular species of plant. Here's another one that I think most people are familiar with, at least the adults. This is the clouded sulfur. Let me go back, sorry. Clouded sulfurs exhibit a behavior of what's known as puddling. And many Lepidopterans do this, but this group in particular is really noticeable because of that bright yellow, dusty wing appearance, and you'll see them in mass. And what it is that the males are getting out, they'll puddle around wet soils, if you've seen them on gravel roads or just where you have maybe a puddle of standing water. You'll see them congregating in masses of 20 or 30, and they're actually extracting salts from the soil in addition to getting the water. And the males are exclusively the ones that do perform this puddling behavior. The females actually get the necessary salts from the males, so it's transferred, which is transferred during mating. Cloud sulfurs feed on a pretty large group. So the Fabaceae, which is the bean family. So if you plant crimson clover as a cover crop, there's almost 100% certainty that you're going to get clouded sulfur larvae, because these are very common, very ubiquitous, and you'll see them, you see them for the most part late summer, early fall. And then our classic monarch, the monarch butterfly, which is a specialist in the genus Asclepias, so our milkweed family. Of course, monarchs are the poster child for conservation, and for good reason. I mean, they have a really interesting biology. Of course, they feed on milkweeds. They ingest those toxins as a warning for would-be predators. And there's a lot of studies that have gone into learned behavior, so predators know to avoid this particular pattern of coloration, both on the adults and on the caterpillars, to know that this is not something that you want to eat. So really interesting, very charismatic group. Again, you see the nymphalids tend to be the more attractive or showier groups, or a group of more showier insects. Again, they feed on Asclepias, so if you planted butterfly weed or milkweed or, common milkweed or whatever you want to call it, plants in the genus Asclepias are attractive. And that includes the tropical milkweed. And I just want to sort of harp on that for a little bit, is that you should avoid tropical milkweed. They're finding now that it has the tendency to hold migratory populations of milkweeds a little bit longer in the season than it should, so they can't complete their southward journey and they get trapped in these colder climates where they don't survive. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But monarchs have 1 to 3 broods. You might have 4 to 6 in southern regions. And again, these broods aren't necessarily what happens here. This is overall as they're living in Mexico and as they move up to Canada. So you may have 4 to 6 broods, or in the warmer climates, and they are migratory during the spring and summer. All right, so where's my viceroy? So it's already showed you the monarch. I didn't realize my quiz was here. Let's do one more poll. This is a pretty easy one. You got a 50-50 chance of getting this one.
Got lots of votes coming in.
Oh, it's close, man. This is close. I like it.
Give everybody a few more seconds. You want to make a call on which one's the viceroy and which one's the monarch. I always call them viceroys. I guess is viceroy the correct?
You can call it anything. Viceroy, viceroy. I don't know if there's just like with any common or scientific name, I think there's probably 5 or 6 ways to say it.
All right. So we got over 70% of people voting, so I'm going to stop the polling and we'll share the results.
Ooh, that's pretty close.
You got it right.
So if you answered A, you win the prize of patting yourself on the back. A is the viceroy and B is the monarch. So our viceroy, you can see here that it's got this line. Whoops. Go back. Has this line on the hind wings that cuts across, whereas our monarch does not have that line. So it's a very convincing mimic. You can see why it would be beneficial, because viceroys don't actually feed on milkweeds. They have no defensive chemicals in their bodies. So they rely on this classic form of mimicry, and very convincingly so, to the point that most predators are unable to tell the difference between a viceroy and a monarch. So pretty incredible how I think animals can mimic one another. One is totally edible, the other one is totally inedible, but it's really difficult to tell the difference. So viceroys are the next group. They're in the same Nymphalidae. They have a really interesting, of course, they're the classic study for Müllerian mimicry. As larvae and as those first and second instars, those really young caterpillars, they look just like bird droppings. So maybe if you've ever looked on a leaf before and saw something that looked like bird poop, it might not have been bird poop at all, because viceroys are pretty convincing mimics as caterpillars, but also as adults. And they are specialists. And actually have a pretty narrow host range. So you'll find them on willows, and even that includes some of our non-native willows, and then the poplars. So if you're familiar with yellow poplar, also called tulip poplar, they feed on the leaves of those plants as well. So these are almost as specialized as monarchs. You'll find them generally at the same time that you'll find monarchs, May to September. You may find in some cases where monarchs are rare, that the wings are actually a brown color. So it seems that where monarchs occur more frequently, those populations of viceroys resemble monarchs more closely, whereas when they don't have that sort of camouflage to rely on, they rely on other forms. So they can change color based on where they are and the presence or absence of monarchs as well. So another interesting sort of tidbit. Here's a pretty cool one. I think most people should be familiar with Eastern tiger swallowtails. These are really, again, very common. You'll see them as the yellow form or in other forms as well. I've even seen one that had one half was a yellow wing and the other half was a dark wing. So that was a really interesting find. But as the larvae, as the caterpillars, they're pretty convincing little snake mimics. So you see here on the sort of this hood or this shroud, this portion of the upper body, these two little eye spots. And, you know, even people still say, well, look at the eyes on that thing. And no, the eyes are down below. So this will, the larva, when disturbed, will actually posture just like a snake might. They even have these little horns that come out of their head that emit a pheromone that's more like a kind of another way that it defends itself from would-be predators. But Eastern tiger swallowtails have a lot of different host plants that they can feed on. So a pretty wide variety of things, which is why I think they're probably a little more common. So cherries, sweet bay magnolias, birches. Again, we see tulip poplar, basswood, so pretty wide host of, or a wide range, a wide variety of plants, even though they are still considered specialists. You'll find these, it seems like almost year round. They have 2 to 3 broods. You find them February through November. They really like, as adults, like lantana and these really exposed flowers. So you'll see them on just a variety, myriad of flowering plants. Here's another one that's a spice bush swallowtail. Same family, different species though. Does somebody have a question? Sorry. Spice bush swallowtail does the same thing, has those eye spots there at the top. As the name implies, the preferred host is spice bush, but you'll find it in a larger variety of plants that it can feed on. So it does have a few species of plants, even though it doesn't always feed on all of the plants within that particular family. So sassafras, sweet bay, magnolia, red bays. This is, if you're down on the coast, unfortunately, red bays are all but wiped out because of the
it's a type of beetle, isn't it? A ambrosia beetle?
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name now for some reason. It's the red bay ambrosia beetle. When in doubt, if you're trying to describe something to an entomologist, just say the name of the plant and then whatever the plant was. So red bay ambrosia beetle, that's pretty close. You'll find spice bush swallowtails, again, kind of in the warmer times of the month, April through October, not quite as long as you would find the other swallowtails. Question marks are a really interesting group, and if you have a chance to see these, you may actually see 2 different forms of the same species depending on the season, because they have 2 broods in a year. They have a summer brood and a winter brood, and what you're actually looking at in this picture is the winter brood. So winter broods emerge they overwinter and they emerge in the spring as adults. They're these brightly colored, really sort of, as far as wings go, they have a really interesting shape. Polygonia literally means angled wings. So that's where that comes from. And the question mark, actually, if you're looking at this one, this is a summer brood adult. If you'll look down sort of on that lower wing, and then this little section here, sort of right in the middle, where you see what looks like a question mark. So if you want to know what this one is, look at the undersides of the wings and it'll tell you that this one is a question mark. And I guess that's where the name comes from. There's also another species called the comma, and instead of the question mark, it has a comma on it. So if you're ever wanting to get this identified, then just look at the undersides there and it'll tell you what it is. So winter broods are brightly colored and orange, and then the summer broods, which undergo a period of sort of hibernation, it's called estivation, that occurs in the summer. So this delayed period of activity in the summer, and then they sort of pick back up in the fall. And you can see why this would be beneficial if you look like this in the fall, right? Because they're sort of the brown drab, maybe even have what might look like something has fed on this, but they're very convincing as leaf mimics. Whereas something like this in the winter would definitely stand out to a predator. A lot of host plants, American elm, hackberry, we're seeing that one again, nettles. I know nettles aren't probably the plant you're going to put in your garden, but just know that nettles and false nettles are actually host plants for the question mark. In fact, they are more of your preferred, especially for your summer broods. These are going to be the plants that question marks feed on the most. Okay. Males hang out on the branches and the tree trunks. They'll actively chase away other insects, and they also chase away birds. So the males are very territorial, especially during mating season. So you can look for that first brood or the summer brood in May through September, and then that second brood will show up August and sort of into the winter months. Okay, so I have more caterpillars and stuff at the end, but I'm going to wrap this up. I just don't know what the time is right now. But if you're going for a shotgun approach, and we've talked about generally, plants in general, plant families, and really not a whole lot about species. But if you're really looking for one genus of plants that's going to just sort of be the end-all be-all, oak trees are it. I know Doug Talamy has done a lot of work with that, but the genus Quercus seems to be sort of that genus of plants that if you're looking for these larval host plants and you're wondering what you should put in your yard, it's got to be oaks. They support, over 500 species of Lepidopterans. And if you take our Carolina chickadee, our resident bird, they may feed one of their nests 350 to 570 caterpillars a day. And so if they are relying on, oak trees, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to be successful. But where we sort of see, a lot of habitat loss is becoming a major problem, I shouldn't say becoming, it is. So if you think about, sort of destruction of natural environments, not only from the loss of canopy cover and the loss of habitat for larvae and larval host plants for caterpillars, butterflies, and moths, but also habitat for birds. And this is also a problem in the sense that it's really creating fragmented landscapes. So we don't just need 2 or 3 oaks. We need a contiguous connectivity across neighborhoods, across counties, across the state. I mean, it really has to be connected in order for us to really see an impact for, attracting wildlife, attracting butterflies and moths, and then we get the other things that come along with it. So yes, we want butterflies, we want moths, we want the host plants to support that, but then the next level up is going to be supporting our birds and supporting the other things that feed on insects in general. So it's kind of a sad note to end on, and I'll try to end on a more positive note. But if you're looking for additional resources, start with a few of these. Butterflies in Your Backyard is a publication from NC State. content. You can find that if you'll just Google search butterflies in your backyard, but there's the website there. And then Butterflies and Moths of North America is just butterfliesandmoths.org. And then if you're looking for more, if you're like me, you like the books, Caterpillars of Eastern North America is a fantastic resource. I actually do not own this, but Charlotte was telling me that it is just an excellent book to have on hand because it has 0 pictures or very few pictures of the adults. It has the larval forms of moths and butterflies, which is really kind of what you need, I think, in order to get some of these identified. And then if you kind of want just more of a general book about insects, well, I shouldn't say general. It does cover all of the insects, but insects, their natural diversity, history and diversity is a big old textbook, and it's a fantastic wealth of knowledge resource. So something that if you wanted to build up your entomology section of your library, I would encourage you to look at, but it's a really nice desk reference. So I just want to end on the sort of the positive, as I think, you know, we're all sort of at home, and I know a lot of gardeners are really focused on their gardens now. You know, definitely take time to observe. I think that's, for me, one of the things that I get most out of putting plants in the ground is knowing that at some point something is going to visit this plant, and I just hope that I get to be there to see it. So if you're really observant, really take time to sort of sit, and I mean that literally, just sit in the middle of your garden bed for a few minutes. You'll be amazed at what you find. And I think as gardeners, and as we become more aware of the need for conservation and habitat conservation, gardeners have, you know, really unique ability to not only set the example, but also help educate people who may have questions, and really sort of, you know, I think we all look at insects as, you know, if it's not pretty and flashy, it's gross. But we need to get past that and move beyond that. And I think gardeners are well situated to do that. And again, you know, start small. This is something that you don't have to be intimidated by. You don't have to be an entomologist. You don't have to know all of the insects that are visiting your yard. It just takes a little bit of curiosity and some willpower, and I think you can be successful no matter what you plant. So I hope that was, I'm gonna open that up for questions. And if there's time, and I don't know that there is, I actually have a few more slides at the end with more specific examples of lepidopterans that we can talk about. But just for the sake of time, I want to end the presentation, and then I'll open it up for questions.
All right, thank you, Sam. I'll tell you what, we'll ask people to put their questions in the chat, and we are running a little late, so we're going to go ahead and switch it over to, I think Mike's going to be up next to share BOLOs, and then we'll come back to the questions. Does that sound good? And of course, you can share your additional slides too.
Okay.
When we come back. All right. But you did get a couple of requests to talk on beetles. So we might be in touch with you for our next, setting up next year's schedule to tell us about beetles.
I have to admit, as much as I think beetles are incredibly fascinating, I would love to talk about it. Matt Bertone literally taught me the beetles. I was in 502 when he taught it to me, so he might be a better resource. But I would definitely be glad to help out if I can.
But I don't have such a beautiful voice. Thanks a lot, Sam. It's good seeing you.
Yeah, you virtually. Too. Yeah, I can only see your picture.
I know. Yeah, here I'll share my screen for a minute. I'm not sure if Mike is. I think Sam might need to stop sharing his screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
sorry.
No worries. And I'm not sure if Mike wanted to go first or not. I think he's actually in the lab doing a little bit of work, but I can go first, Mike, if you'd like.
Matt, I just sent you a chat saying, please go first.
Great, no problem. All right, I will start up my little presentation. Let me make sure. Why is it not showing? Why is it not showing my PowerPoint? There we go. All right, everyone. Well, I'm just going to quickly go through some BOLOs and be on the lookouts for June. As you heard from Sam, there are lots of caterpillars that are out and about, and I'm just going to highlight a couple. But really, right now, you're going to see a lot of some young and some older caterpillars. There's some caterpillars that are doing pretty well right now, have come out a little earlier, and others that are just getting started. So one thing you need to look for is especially bagworms. So I posted this on Facebook last year. We got a little branch. You can see how small this branch was, and it had 30 young bagworms on it. And you can see they're very tiny. They look like just the little twigs on the branch of this arborvitae. So be on the lookout for them. They're going to be small now, but once you notice them very large later on, they're going to be too large to actually control or do anything about. The other things are, maybe near the later end of the month, you're going to start seeing maybe small webworm tents being created in plants. They're more of a late summer type of species. That's when we'll notice them more, but that's usually when they're very large. I, in fact, took this photo up in Maryland, where it should be a little cooler, and in June of last year, or 2 years ago. So there are going to be some small tents from these fall webworms coming out soon. And of course, I could go on and on about all of the other different caterpillars that are going to be on your veggies in your gardens, on your plants out in the yard. And the lookalikes, of course, are going to be the sawflies. There are going to be a bunch of sawflies coming out. In fact, yesterday I saw a large elm sawfly, my first time seeing that family. But these are some sawflies on... these are another type of elm sawfly, actually. These are a much smaller species, but they look a lot like caterpillars. You can tell sawflies because they have one lens in their eye, and they have 6 or more pairs of prolegs on their abdomen. And that's really good to know because, for instance, sawflies don't respond to BT control because they are not a Lepidopteran. They are a Hymenopteran, a type of wasp, basically. Of course, also, the Japanese beetles are going to start coming out very soon. Watch your roses. They like grapes. They like a lot of different plants, but particularly we see them on rosaceous plants. So roses in particular, prunus, grapes also, and they the adults will skeletize the leaves. You'll see them abundantly. I'm not sure who here has never seen a Japanese beetle. They're pretty popular, but well, not popular among gardeners, but they are very common, at least. These green and bronze and brown beetles with these white spots of hair. We're also going to see a lot of different bugs coming out, especially lace bugs. This is an eggplant lace bug from last June, and also garden flea hoppers. So there's going to be a lot of leaf hoppers also, lots of lace bugs, lots of plant bugs. I saw a lot of them yesterday too, some plant bug nymphs and even adults. So lots of sucking insects out there on the plants, sucking the green out of them. You may see some very large flies. Don't be afraid. These large tiger bee flies are actually parasitizing carpenter bees. So yay, I guess. So some people might be happy about that. Here, this one had merged from my deck from a carpenter bee hole. And if you see these very large black flies about the size of a carpenter bee with this mottled wing, don't kill them. They don't sting, they don't bite, and they are only a concern if you are a carpenter bee. I don't think there are any carpenter bees tuning in today. Of course, be on the lookout for mosquitoes and ticks. The season is up and running. The mosquitoes, of course, help yourself by wearing some repellent if you're in the woods or you're really outside and getting attacked by them. With ticks, just check yourself when you've been out, especially in high grass or vegetation. They're going to be out looking for humans to feed on. And this is a female Lone Star tick showing the single dot on the back. And of course, everything else. So it's all bets are off for things that just everything's out. It's going to be June It's everything's active. You may see things like this crazy moth, this tube-making moth, which often feed in grass. And you can see something like a lizard beetle. So I just put random things on there. I could show you hundreds of photos of things that I took in June. So get out there and see. And lastly, I just want to make a note, things you are not likely to see. So there's a lot of things on the news lately about murder hornets or Asian giant hornets. You won't see them in North Carolina. I won't say it's 100% on the dot. We can't be completely certain, but it is almost impossible for you to see them in North Carolina right now. So we're getting a lot of emails, we're getting a lot of calls about them. I'll send a link. I'll put a link in the chat in a moment when Mike starts on an online guide to lookalikes that we developed through NC State. And but here is an Asian giant hornet, and you're going to see a few lookalike wasps coming out very soon that are very large. Again, anytime somebody sees a big wasp, they might assume it's an Asian giant hornet, but again, it is almost impossible for it to be here. And I can tell you more later on if you want to ask questions. But the most likely candidates that you guys see are European hornets, which have been here for almost 200 years, about 180 years. And to tell the difference, I'll show you a side-by-side. So the main difference is the European hornet is almost as big as an Asian giant hornet. The main differences you're going to look for are the European hornet has most of the back of the head is a deep reddish color, whereas Asian giant hornets, the entire head is this mustard yellow color. Also, Asian giant hornets, their eyes are far forward on their head. There's actually about twice the width of an eye behind the head, behind each eye, whereas European hornets, the eyes are almost equal distance from the back of the head as their width. Also notice that both hornets have this little notch in the eye that's going to become important in the next slide. But another really important characteristic is that European hornets, their stripes have these little teardrop or dots connected, whereas Asian giant hornets have very distinct stripes. They don't have any of those extra little appendages or anything like that. And lastly, at the end of June, you may start seeing cicada killers emerge. They're usually a later summer when the cicadas come out, species, July, August, but we have seen them as early as late June. So just to be sure about these insects do not have a notch in their eye. They are very large. Their head is a little bit thinner than their thorax, and their abdomen is pointed and mostly black with a few faint yellow markings near the base. So be on the lookout for all those other things, but if you see a large wasp, be sure that it's, be sure to know how to tell them apart from Asian giant hornets, and know that it is extremely unlikely that you'll ever see an Asian giant hornet. And if they were to become established in the US or North Carolina, we'd let everyone know as soon as we knew. But for now, keep an eye out and just make sure that you know your lookalikes. And I'll post that link in a second. And with that, I'll let Mike go.
All right.
And yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm using a different speaker microphone here, so I hope everyone can hear me all right. Am I coming through? All right, thank you. So I just have a very few BOLOs to share on the diseases, and I narrowed it down to some of the ones that were the showiest things that you'll see that are going to be pretty common. Starting out with the trees and the shrubs, on the maples, I've already started to see, especially on small Japanese maples, some light-colored necrotic spots on the leaves, and you'll suspect one of two fungal problems there, either Philostichta leaf spot or anthracnose. Both of these are typical for any kind of leaf spots on a deciduous tree. They're a cosmetic problem. They're going to vary in their severity from one year to the next, depending on the weather, but it's not something you need to be concerned about. It's not going to actually kill the tree. Entomosporium, most folks should recognize that by now. The two hosts that we see it most on are, well, we don't see it much on Photinia anymore, but it's because most of the Photinias are now removed from the landscape because of this disease. It causes a tremendous amount of defoliation. And folks who planted Photinias as a screen so that they wouldn't either see or be seen by their neighbors, those are now not serving that purpose and have been removed. We do see it though on Indian hawthorn, quite a bit of difference between or from variety to variety in the severity of the leaf spot that you'll get, and you can be in just about any time of year. So the typical reddish, very red leaf spots that eventually develop a small gray blister-like fruiting body in the center. You may need a hand lens to see that. But those symptoms, if you see them on Indian hawthorn, are going to be of Entomosporium leaf spot. What we've been calling cedar quince rust, certainly one of the gymnosporangium rusts, although I haven't been entirely convinced that it's exactly that species, but it's going to be very common. I've seen it already on calorie pear fruits. So it forms these papery, membranous coverings around the ecia that release large quantities of dry orange spores that will, if they're lucky, blow over and find a juniper somewhere to infect and complete the life cycle. And it can also infect the twigs. So you see sometimes the sporulation and swelling on twigs. And I have already seen a number of examples this year of rose rosette. I haven't checked here in North Carolina, but I wouldn't be surprised if this like has been observed, let's say, I think it was in Texas, where you get kind of two peaks during the year of when you see the most rose rosette symptoms, one in the spring and then one later, maybe late summer. But we're certainly in a peak right now. So look for those first symptoms of shoots that elongate more than they should and don't lose the red juvenile coloration like they're supposed to. If you've got a plant that's had an infection for a longer period of time, then you're going to start seeing the other symptoms like witch's broom, deformation of the flowers, canes that are larger or stems that are larger than the cane that they're growing out of, hyperthorniness, and so on. In the fruits area, just for a few things to quickly look for, another gymnosporangium rust, the cedar apple rust, will be, well, we should be right now in the spermatial stage, so the bright yellow glistening spots on the upper surface of the leaf. And then as we get into June, we'll see the estial stage forming, not entirely unlike what you get with the cedar quince rust on those fruits, but less of a peridium, less of that membranous extension around the fruiting body. And again, this will complete its life cycle by infecting junipers. The fire blight you may see as well on apple affecting leaves and stems. I just highlight one thing here for muscadine grape because that is so sensitive to some of our herbicides. So you may see the leaf deformation, the little edges of the leaf standing out there like little protruding veins. This would be fairly typical of herbicide entry on that plant. Blueberry, we mentioned, I think, for the first time last year, this disease called Exobasidium leaf spot or leaf and fruit spot. And I showed the picture on the lower left there at the time, which see how a very light yellow spot on the upper surface and almost white underneath. But what I didn't show at that time was that as the disease progresses, these spots will die and you'll get the typical brown necrotic spot look. So depending on what time of the cycle that you catch it at, you may see one or the other symptoms. And blueberries are also known for their propensity to get Bactrosphaeria stem blight, so that's another disease to be watching for. As the fruits develop on the peaches, for those of you in peach producing parts of the state, scab is a very important disease on the homeowner peach orchard, and it will have small spots on the fruit, but as the fruit tries to grow and expand, they'll often crack there where those infections occurred. Whereas brown rot is a disease that it will really start to advance once the fruit is nearing maturity, and then takes it over with a decay, a soft decay of the entire fruit that then leaves a mummy. So as usual, make sure that you're following your fruit orchard spray program. In the vegetable garden, just to mention The two of the more popular groups here on the cucurbits. We always need by June to be, late May into June, we need to be on the lookout for downy mildew. It's often seen on cucumber, but it can occur on others. And cucumber, it typically forms very yellow angular leaf spots, as you see in the photograph there, a little bit fuzzy the photo. And you may or may not see the sort of darkish, smoky sporulation on the underside. Whereas powdery mildew, that is going to be especially on your squashes, including pumpkin, and will have the typical whitish, powdery look on both the upper and lower surface. A couple other leaf things that you may see on your cucurbits would be anthracnose, gummy stem blight, of course, on stems, and never rule out the root nematodes. See things like wilting going on, and take a look at the roots and see if you don't have that, which applies as well to tomato. Well, blossom end rot, of course, especially on those first clusters of fruit that aren't getting enough calcium. Various leaf spots, including bacterial spot, septoria leaf spot, which is a fungus, and tomato spotted wilt virus. The photograph in the lower right there was from a homeowner who submitted his image of a tomato sample. You can see not just a few spots, but quite a bit of spotting there on the young foliage of the tomato. That is a virus that's brought to the tomato plants from thrips that are moving out of the weeds. If your tomatoes are wilting, think bacterial wilt, think possibly southern stem blight. In that case, look for the decay at the very soil line. And again, root knot nematode. And herbicide injury, I've shown images before of what glyphosate injury looks like, a very light yellow color to the base of the leaf that's on the tomato. So as we get the vegetable gardening season cranked up, we'll start seeing more and more of these kinds of problems. And finally, in the turf area, as at any time of year, fairy ring can occur, either the green rings, the dead rings, or we'll soon start seeing the rings that have mushrooms and puffballs in them. These are not pathogenic or not, well, parasitic fungi, but they are in the thatch layer there and causing problems to the turf that way. Dollar spot on any turf species, and brown patch on your cooler season grasses, tall fescue and ryegrass, as they become stressed by the warmer weather. You'll see the picture in the lower right there. This was an area on campus in front of Kilgore Hall a few years ago where they had alternating strips of tall fescue, and I'm not sure what the elder grass was, but it was only the tall fescue there that was affected so much by the brown patch. And I threw in one that's not a disease, but chinch bugs, because they can cause symptoms on St. Augustine grass as we go forward. I'm going to stop sharing long enough to be able to look at the chat here and see if any questions have come in. Right, will this PowerPoint be available to us? Yeah, we do usually make sometimes a slightly modified copy for distribution available. Like to say how to control some of the pathogens he is mentioning. Unfortunately, with the format here, Deborah, the BOLO format, we're letting you know what to look out for, but for time limitations, we're not able to. But if you have specific questions about them, go ahead and feel free to mail us. And oops, lost the chat box. Brown patch here in Leyland, Warren, and it's here. Okay, not a surprise. All right.
There was a question further up about entomosporium, if it could attack holly.
No, entomosporium leaf spot will not affect holly. Thanks for catching that. I stopped reading when I started seeing the insect questions there.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, thank you, Mike. I'll finish up with the plant and weed of the month. Then we'll come back because there were several great questions to follow back up with Sam. And then Sam can finish out his slide. So I know we've gone a little long today, but if you can hang on, I think there'll be lots more interesting stuff to learn about. And we'll come back to all of these questions. So we do have our plant of the month this month, and of course with our plant of the month we're looking for those plants that do more than just serve an aesthetic value, that also feed our pollinators, feed our birds, feed our ecosystems. And we're looking for plants that can be grown across North Carolina. And these are commercially produced, but they may not be at every garden center or especially big box stores. So you might need to look around a little bit for them. We do have an archive, so you can review the past plant and weed of the month. And I'll pop those in the chat. And this month, the month of May, plant of the month is New Jersey tea. It's just coming into bloom in my garden, Ceanothus americanus. And this is a native shrub that does occur all across North Carolina and, in fact, most of the eastern United States, and is often found on dry, sunny slopes or woodland edges. So it is one of the more drought tolerant of our native plants. It does not like wet feet, so you do want to give a site with good drainage. And it's a little different than many of our native shrubs in that it stays relatively small. So a lot of our native shrubs get pretty big, but especially when this one is out in full sun, it will stay pretty tight, only 2 to 3 feet tall, maybe 3 to 4 feet wide. Could be a little larger in shade. Or part shade. So it's not going to be happy in full shade, but just a few hours of shade or say maybe shade in the morning, it should be fine. The blooms are starting to open, these little tiny white blossoms in clusters. So lots of little blossoms and little tiny clusters tend to attract a lot of beneficial insects and pollinators, which this certainly does. You even get hummingbirds visiting it. There are several types of native bees. I don't know if Matt can make out or Sam can make out what these, I think this is like some type of little tiny wasp pollinating the flowers here. I'm not quite sure what species that is on it. But in addition to the flowers serving as a food source for many of our pollinators and beneficial insects, it is the larval host for several species of moths. So you'll get caterpillars that feed on it, and then of course the birds that feed on the caterpillars, but including quite a few different types of moths. There's also a type of skipper, the mottled dusky wing, and a butterfly, the spring azure. Caterpillars will feed on this. So you get a lot of different things using the plant as well as birds eating the seeds. So the flowers open now, and they're attractive for several weeks depending on the weather and the season. Then the seeds start to form, and so later in the summer the seeds will be kind of these green pods, and then they'll turn kind of a reddish color before they dry to brown. And songbirds can feed on the seed pods. So the Virginia Native Plant Society actually has a great profile on this plant. If you want to learn more about it, and it goes into some of the natural history and ethnobotany. So when you go to the archive, you will find these slides right after we finish today, because I need to post them to the archive. But when you find the slides in the archive, you will find a link to that Virginia Native Plant profile if you want to learn more about New Jersey tea. But our weed of the month is one that probably I bet everybody has coming up somewhere in their yard, definitely in many, many, many places in my yard, and that is crabgrass. There's actually several different species of crabgrass. They're in the Digitaria genus. The one that's most often talked about is large crabgrass, also called hairy crabgrass, which some of the other species are also called hairy crabgrass. There's one called smooth crabgrass, but this one's Digitaria sanguinalis. And so what you're looking for now is these little weeds that are coming up. In some areas, you might still have young ones sprouting. I have tons after this rain. I also have some larger ones that are a little more established. But if you can get them now, hand weeding now in areas like vegetable gardens can certainly help for later in the season when they would be much larger and producing seed. So these are warm season annuals. Most of the seedlings that are coming up now, the weed seedlings or weedlings, are warm season annuals. So they're coming up now. They're going to grow all summer. They're going to start producing flowers and seeds later in the summer and in the fall. That will ensure next year's crop of weeds, and the frost will kill them. For these crabgrass species, they will often grow kind of hugging the ground, because where they touch the ground at the nodes, they'll produce roots, which makes them even harder to pull up when they get large, because not only do they have the main root system, but everywhere they touch the ground, they're producing more roots. And this is definitely a weed of anywhere, landscapes, gardens, lawns. So there are different management strategies depending on the time of the year, kind of the development stage of the weed. So we've passed before germination. Actually, we probably will continue to get germination of crabgrass, you know, into to the summer. But really, when we were talking about before germination, we were focusing on, say, February and early March, but preferably February, because there is a trend for these to germinate earlier than they used to as our springs arrive earlier. So making sure you've got a really good layer of mulch, which is keeping the seeds in the dark, down in the soil. They're not exposed to light, so they don't germinate. It's your best defense in landscape beds. In turf, you can use pre-emergent herbicides, which are typically applied in February, and with many of them, split applications recommended in the South, because we do have a second wave of germination with crabgrass. Those herbicides, if you go to the NCSU turf files, there is a fact sheet on crabgrass that lists many of the different herbicides, or all of the different herbicides that are available. And then now, excuse me, when we're after germination in the spring and summer, especially when you have the really small weeds around, if you can do some hand weeding, can be really effective in gardens and landscape beds. In areas maybe where they're growing in paths, or where it's just not practical to do hand weeding, there are herbicides you can use. There are things that are non-selective, like Roundup type products that contain glyphosate, or there are herbicides that are selective for grasses, those with active ingredients like sethoxidum or fluazafop. So you definitely want to make sure and read and follow the label directions, but do be aware that there are some herbicides out there that are just for grass control, so they won't harm broadleaf plants, and then vice versa, there are herbicides for broadleaf weeds. So make sure you know your herbicide and what you're spraying, so that you can use it safely and get the effect that you're looking for. And especially later this summer, when you see these things starting to seed out, I know the seed head is a familiar sight to everybody. You want to make sure and get them out of the garden. If you can do some hand weeding then, before anything starts to ripen, the seeds start to ripen and drop, you will help reduce next year's population. Couple of announcements and just a couple things to make sure you're aware of before we get back to Sam and the questions. There is a new part of the Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox open now called the Design Gallery. It is really exciting. It's an opportunity for you to go in and look at plants used in different ways. There's different collections of images based on the garden design theme. And when you click on each picture, I think what the neatest part is all of the plants are identified. So you can find out what plants are there, and you can learn more about each one of them. So we really appreciate everyone who has contributed to that, and there are more opportunities to contribute to that. So Kathleen Moore is organizing this, coordinates the project. So if you have images you'd like to contribute, you can contact Kathleen. A really exciting opportunity coming up next Tuesday. We're going to have a special Master Gardener Continuing Education webinar with Craig LaHoulier, who is known as the North Carolina Tomato Man. He's the author of Epic Tomatoes. He's going to talk to us about using containers and straw bales to bring your garden to the sun. So that is open to North Carolina Master Gardener volunteers, and an email will be going out in just a day or two with that, with a registration link. So we want people to register just so we make sure we do have enough capacity for everybody to be part of that. So you'll get an email for that with the registration link, and that email will go out to agents as well as to the EMGV email list. So if you're on it and you got an announcement about today's webinar, you'll get that. If you're not on it, you can subscribe, but it is now a Google group, so the subscription's a little different. You'll get a box should pop up like this where you can put your email address to subscribe, and you'll receive a confirmation email that you have to click something to finalize that subscription. But through testing, I've discovered it actually often goes to spam. So be sure to check your spam filter. Within a minute or two of entering your email here and hitting submit, you should get that email. If you don't, check your spam. And I put these links in the chat. You can find online education opportunities on our calendar where we're posting things, different talks agents are giving, and other opportunities for Master Gardener volunteers to participate in online education. All right, before we finish it up, I'm going to turn it back over to Sam, and we'll look at the questions that have been coming into the chat.
Yeah, so I scrolled over, or I scrolled up, and I may have missed some, so I apologize if I forgot or if I missed somebody's questions, but I did see one that I thought was pretty interesting in that there are groups that are raising monarchs in captivity and going to extremes like bleaching eggs, leaves, etc. Also killing all the other insects that rely on milkweed. What are my thoughts? Probably the worst person to ask. You're asking someone as an entomologist what I would do. That does sound extreme. I don't know what the context of how they're raising, if they're raising them specifically for something or if it's used as sort of a way station. But I would avoid that. And, you know, I come at everything from an ecology perspective. So we have done such a good job, and other organizations have done a really great job of raising so much awareness about the need to conserve and protect butterflies, monarchs specifically, that we've totally neglected all the other things that need milkweed to survive, and, you know, sort of to their detriment, as kind of this question is getting to. So I would avoid as much as possible. I know aphids are a problem, and there was a question about how to control aphids. You know, I'd pinch, you know, I'll just early in the season when the numbers are still low, I'll get out and just sort of squish everything with my hands. But then there's going to be a point where you'd be out there for hours on end. There would never be an end to it. So there is a point where I just let it go, and whatever happens, happens. But just this morning I was out and I already see lady beetle larvae feeding on the aphids. There were ants. You all may be familiar or aware that ants will actually farm aphids because of the honeydew that they excrete. So there's already a lot of stuff going on. I hate to disrupt that, even with numbers being so low. So avoid these extremes of controlling, you know, what pest, anything other than monarchs. If you're going to use, obviously, an insecticide, try to treat with oils and soaps, something that would be considered organic, but you definitely stay away from these harsher chemicals. But yeah, I think that's kind of my take on it. You know, if you came to my yard when I had a yard, it was probably just the worst looking place on earth. It's just, you know, bugs and critters all over the place. It did not look very attractive, but it was fun from my standpoint because of all the stuff that was there. I had a question about how to tell the difference between moths and butterflies. I actually read something pretty funny that said that they compared it to how Romans in Roman time considered if you weren't a Roman, you were considered a barbarian. So I think that's kind of how we look at butterflies and moths. Generally speaking, moths tend to be nocturnal. So you see them more active at night, although there are the exceptions. But for the most part, they're pretty similar. They both go through complete metamorphosis. You saw that just because some are more showy than others, you can't always rely on that as a, you know, diagnostic feature. I think moths tend to sort of be lumped into this sort of boring, drab, you know, gray or brown group of insects, but they're really not. You know, you saw some really interesting pictures, but, you know, your butterflies, they tend to be more active during the day, which is why I think, you know, there's sort of this distinction. But, you know, again, generally speaking, nocturnal versus active, you know, diurnal, active during the day would kind of be a good way to go. And then there was a question about the difference between a viceroy and monarchs, and that maybe the size difference. I think they're pretty similar in size. But one of the things that I forgot to mention with identification is that monarchs have a very distinctive flight pattern. So they have in the middle of flapping their wings, they'll actually glide for a couple of seconds. So they'll kind of flap, and then glide. Whereas like a viceroy or some other butterflies sort of just tend to have this really erratic looking, just sort of they're frantically flapping their wings and they don't glide. So that would be how you would really tell the difference sort of on the wing, as it were, without getting too close or having to get too close to them. But size difference, there's really not a whole lot of difference there. Were there any, did I miss any questions? I think that was.
Did you get the question about, do you do anything about aphids on milkweed?
Yeah, so no, again, I'm the worst when it comes to pest management advice. Another thing that I think gardeners are well suited to do is that now with this really big push for native plants, when people really start to see what native plants look like when they're fed upon, they freak out. There's a lot of panic. How do I control these insects? Well, you planted native, so now you're getting all the joys and things that come with planting native. Insects will feed on them. So aphids, early season, like now, starting to see some actually kind of larger numbers of aphids this time of year than what I'm used to, but I just pinch them by hand, and then around about middle of June, 1st of July, I just let it go, because that's really the time where things start to get good. You start to see your parasitic wasps, you see your lady beetles, ladybugs, all the other things, your assassin bugs start to show up, and that's when I'm like, I just turn it over. Just like, there's really no sense in trying to control this when this is literally the purpose, right? So native plants should be providing something, a little bit of something for everyone. That's probably not the answer y'all wanted to hear, but that's what I got for you.
That's good. I also just leave them alone. I have a lot of milkweeds and just let the aphids and the beneficials tend to come in and balance them out. So,
right.
I think there was a question about.
Go ahead. I was just going to say to kind of go back to the beginning of the presentation is that, kind of think about your yard and, how it sort of, we tend to think about our yards as being this, bordered, protected area, right? But really our landscapes are very fluid. They insects, animals move in and out. So when we add plants to our landscape, we're going to be attracting the things that feed on those plants. And ultimately, I think what our goal is it shouldn't be native per se. It should be trying to create an environment that is complex in the sense that vegetatively it is a complex system where you have a ground cover layer. We mentioned leaving leaf litter for your Luna moths as an example. You have an herbaceous layer, a shrub layer, and so on and so forth. So you're creating this environment that is both diverse and complex. And those are different things. But I think sometimes we kind of get wrapped up in the native discussion when we should be really talking about trying to create low maintenance and stable, complex landscapes. And that could be our goal there. But anyway, that's my soapbox. I'll try not to get too much on it. But I do want to say that I grew New Jersey tea when I lived in Wilmington, and that is a fantastic plant. That thing is it's super drought tolerant. I think I watered it maybe a couple of times, and then we had some extra rain, and it just is a wonderful, wonderful little plant. It's a great one to try. And I've kind of found that it's hard to find. So this plant is definitely worth the effort if you can locate it.
Yeah, you'll probably need to look for nurseries that actually specialize in
right.
native plants, and then like when some places like the North Carolina Botanical Garden are back open, they usually have it available as well. Okay. There was a question from Debbie. Debbie Dillion. It was a great question. I can't find it now, but I remember it in the chat that Debbie was asking if there is a resource that links insect emergence to growing degree days. Do you know of anything broad like that? Or if Matt has ever run anything across like that?
I've used a growing degree day calendar for crabgrass emergence. No, I don't have anything specific for insects, but Matt, do you have anything?
There's nothing in general for all different types of insects. There are, I know Jim Wagenbach and a few other specialists put together announcements for certain crop pests and orchard pests, things like that. But for everyday garden pests, we don't have one that I know of. So, yeah.
Debbie, is there a reason
Yeah.
that are you looking for something specific or just something general? Is she still here?
She's still in. She's still here. You want
Matt,
to unmute Debbie
Matt
if you're going?
Jones said something.
Yeah, so Matt mentioned the North Carolina Climate Office. So that's what I was thinking, and I went and checked it, but they're pretty specific. There's like ones for blueberries, there's growing degree day calendars for some specific things. But Debbie just said she would like to know when to alert folks that pest insects are coming.
That's a tough one with the yeah, I mean, degree days obviously are helpful because they change when the climate and the weather changes, so they're up to date. But basically, the best thing to do is scout and know when the general times of year, know what plants are being hit and what plants you value the most. Definitely get out there and look at those plants and see what's on them. But it's really difficult to predict for sure, even with degree days, whether something's going to definitely be out or not. So really just being out there and observing can be one of the best things.
And the link that Matt shared that will take you to the North Carolina Climate Office does actually give you a map of North Carolina that shows you the degree growing days across the state where things stand right now. This is pretty interesting. All right. There were just a couple more questions, I think, about are monarchs and viceroys similar size?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And what is the difference between weevils and caterpillars?
That is a good question. Weevils are beetles, so they're in a family Curculionidae. And then caterpillars are obviously Lepidopteran. So if you're looking at it from a pest management standpoint, they get treated very differently. And the classic case, I think I saw that question. The classic example was the cotton boll weevil that was successfully eradicated. I think there's even a statue somewhere in Alabama or Georgia, I don't know, but it has that weevil on it. And then, yeah, so caterpillars are caterpillars and are the larval immature forms of moths or butterflies.
I'll just add to that real quick. I think as far as if you find the larvae, there are very few weevil larvae that you'll find out on plants, but some. And weevil larvae will never have true thoracic legs, so the true jointed legs, whereas caterpillars almost always have true jointed legs with claws on their thorax. And so that's one of the best ways to tell the difference. Of course, also the caterpillars have the prolegs with the crochets, the little hooks on them, and weevils, larvae won't have them at all. So the only weevils that you'd find on leaves are going to be things like vegetable weevil or alfalfa weevil. And they look kind of like caterpillars because they're greenish in color, but they won't have any legs at all.
All right. There was one question about rabbit tobacco, if it's a good larval host plant. So that is a common name for, I've seen it applied to a couple of different weeds and native plants, but including Nephalium, the cudweeds. So if it's referring to cudweed, those are larval host plant for American lady butterflies, I believe, painted lady. And then I think the last question is about herbs that attract butterflies. Pat said she's planted parsley to attract butterflies, and then Georgia also suggested bronze fennel, which are both host plants for black swallowtails. But any other herbs that would be good for butterflies? And I guess most herbs, when they bloom, are actually good for the adult butterfly. The blossoms are, and you'll get a lot of pollinators visiting things like thyme and oregano if you let them bloom out. But as far as serving as larval hosts, other than the like parsley and bronze fennel, I don't know that many herbs serve as a larval host. Do you know, Sam?
Yeah, those are about the only two that I've ever seen on herbs.
Dill. Yeah, dill's mentioned too. That same group. Yeah.
Right.
All for the black swallowtail.
With herbs, yeah, like you mentioned, it definitely letting them flower out, and it's you kind of get more support for butterflies and moths from the flowers than maybe you do from the larval or caterpillar form side of things. But I think with Elsa's talk when she spoke about bees, bees also use herbs as a kind of a disinfectant to clean themselves. So this is, herbs are fantastic for a lot of different reasons, and that would be definitely I know if you're growing parsley because you want to eat it, it becomes problematic. But other than that, it's a great little plant.
All right. I think we have wrapped up all the questions. I did see that someone was having trouble with the link for subscribing to the email list, and I will check on that and see what's going on. It should take you to a Google group site that gives you that box where you can sign up. But I'll send a follow-up out to agents and ask them to forward it to their volunteers for folks who haven't signed up for that list. Well, thank you so much, Sam. Wonderful job. You got, yeah, absolutely. That was the other thing in the chat. I'm sure you saw you got lots and lots of compliments, and several people down in Brunswick saying they missed you. And then, of course, the request for future talks on beetles.
Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed it and appreciate the enthusiasm.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody who's been hanging on. So we will be back next month, June 23rd, where Matt and Mike will be our feature presenters talking about current pest and plant disease issues of the time. And in between now and then, we encourage you to check out the playlist on YouTube where this recording will be posted, and our past recording index where you can see recordings from many years past for the plants, pests, and pathogens. So we're going to play us out. Whoops. I was going to attempt to play the music to leave, but it doesn't look like it's going to cooperate. So we're just going to end there. Thank you all. Yeah, it's telling me it's having problems with it. I hope everybody has a great week, and appreciate you hanging out with us this morning.
All right, thanks, Charlotte.